Today I'm going to show you why Midjourney's ability to create this 2D image in seconds means AI might soon be helping artists shape the future of 3D game worlds. I'll also be showing you how to start using it to create your own game worlds with a workflow I developed after thousands of tests this week using Midjourney, Dalle, Adobe, and Unreal Engine 5. But first, as a bit of context, let's take a second to appreciate how huge game worlds are today. Some of them are so huge that they're better measured in how many planets or galaxies they approximate in the case of No Man's Sky or Starfield, but even outside of these anomalies, games like Skyrim, The Witcher, and Breath of the Wild are still in the tens or hundreds of square kilometers. To put this in perspective, Ocarina of Time, which at release felt like a big open world to my 9-year-old self, is only 0.41 square kilometers. In contrast, the Hyrule and Breath of the Wild is 360 square kilometers. That's 880 times larger than the Hyrule of Ocarina of Time. This huge jump in scale is requiring game artists and devs to create more and more content to fill these expanding worlds, and in order to do this, companies are constantly developing new tools and techniques to help them do so. Now, when it comes to AI, there are a lot of different projects exploring 3D asset creation. However, none of them have quite mastered it yet. Even the most promising projects in their current state are still pretty rough. So until they get there, in today's video, I'm going to show you why AI's insane advancements in 2D over the last year might actually mean AI will soon be creating the vast majority of these game worlds, but maybe not in the way you might think. For example, you may not have realized, but everything you see in a 3D game environment is actually 2D. Now, of course, I know that sounds a bit sensational, so for those who are new to creating game art, let me quickly explain the relationship between 3D and 2D in these environments. Whether it's a prop character or the actual environment around you, all objects in a game world start as what we call 3D meshes. These meshes are like skeletons made up of tens, hundreds, or even thousands of triangles that come together to create the shape and form of the object and are what give us that three-dimensional structure that we can move around and interact with. However, these 3D meshes on their own are like blank canvases. They don't have color, texture, or any of the attributes that make them look real or stylized according to the game's art direction. All of these details of what you actually see on a mesh comes from what we simply call a material, which is created from a set of 2D images referred to as textures, which are wrapped around the 3D meshes to give them their final appearance. These individual textures define everything from the colors and patterns to the way light interacts with the surface of an object. They add the details that transform a gray 3D mesh into a textured object that looks like it belongs in a game's world. If you still don't quite understand the 2D 3D relationship, the best analogy I can think of to explain this relationship between meshes and their materials is the wrapping around a present. The wrapping paper is your material, which is made up of different textures, the colors, patterns, and maybe a particular glossy or matte finish, while the gift box itself is your 3D mesh. Now, in order to create this relationship between 3D meshes and 2D materials, the first step artists take is a process called UV unwrapping, which, like the name implies, is a bit like wrapping a present in reverse. Artists take a 3D object and make cuts in strategic places to unfold it onto a 2D plane, just like you would unwrap a present if you were trying to flatten the wrapping onto a floor. This results in what we call a UV tile, which is typically a 1x1 square with the flattened out mesh mapped out across its U and V coordinates. Game engines then later use these coordinates to remap the 2D images you create as textures back onto the 3D mesh in the right places, giving you that final look you actually see in your game environments. The fact all of these textures are created from 2D images is why I was maybe a bit cheeky in saying that everything you actually see is 2D, but this is very good news for us when it comes to AI, and I'll explain why in a few moments. First, let's quickly review how these textures are created today so we can see how big of an impact AI might have down the line. When it comes to texturing 3D game art assets, there are many different techniques to do so. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to largely split them into two different types. The first type is unique materials, which are used for objects and characters within a scene that require a unique look. The process for creating these unique materials is very much like I just described, in that an artist takes a mesh, whether it's a character or a prop, UV unwraps it, then brings it into something like Substance Painter where they texture it exactly how it should look. They then export all of their texture work as a set of images, which are then recombined in a game engine as a material that is wrapped around the asset using the UV coordinates defined by the layout in the UV tile. Because the engine is relying on these U and V coordinates to place the textures back onto the object, This means you can't just place the same texture work you created onto a different object that has a different UV layout. Though creating unique materials gives you as an artist the most amount of control over how textures are placed and how they look on a mesh, this process is very time consuming, and even with the procedural tools we have available to us today, still largely everything is done by hand, so it's reserved for a lot more of the hero props or assets that players will get up close to or interact with in a game environment. The second major type of material, which you'll see is much more relevant for the AI workflows I'll walk you through in a few moments, is called a tileable material. Now, in order to understand where tileable materials might make sense as opposed to unique ones, imagine for a moment all of the elements in nature or even within your own home that display recurring patterns. The walls and floors of your house, the exterior of a large building, the huge expanse of a desert, or even a field blanketed in grass. All of these examples are largely just patterns that repeat over and over again. In game dev, a tileable material is essentially just a segment of these repetitive patterns encapsulated into a single module. Objects that make use of tileable materials still require UV unwraps for their meshes. However, the unwrapping is done in a way which makes them modular. Take this 2x2 meter floor mesh, for instance. Its UV unwrap occupies the entire tile, implying that when you position another identical floor mesh right next to it, the UV map will simply repeat the same texture which is applied to it. To leverage these repeating UV maps, tileable textures like this asphalt from Megascans are designed to be seamlessly repeatable so that when applied to these UV maps, a single texture can span across an infinite number of meshes requiring the same pattern. This modular approach of creating a single mesh with a single UV layout and pairing it with a single texture and then being able to use them over huge surface areas makes tileable materials an indispensable and incredibly efficient part of the game art pipeline in game dev today. There are a number of strategies that game artists and devs use to mask the repeating look of these tileable textures, which are beyond the scope of this video, but if you revisit any game environment you're familiar with, you can begin to see how these tileable textures are providing a base for the vast majority of 3D game worlds. If you look at how these tileable materials are actually created, the majority of them are done in a program called Substance Designer, where incredibly talented material artists use a network of tens, hundreds, or even thousands of nodes to procedurally layer up and build an incredibly complex material. These materials can then be used by themselves or blended with other ones to cover huge surface areas in a game environment, which would be impossible or at least impractical to texture uniquely by hand. However, while you can create any material imaginable in Designer, the process is incredibly technical and time consuming even for something like a simple brick material like you see here. In recent years, we've also been getting an increasing number of material libraries built from scan data, Megascans being the most notable one, where as opposed to creating materials wholly in CG like in Substance Designer, companies or artists have gone out into the real world and using various techniques literally scanned surfaces and then compiled and used that data to create photoreal materials. The benefit to this approach is that materials built from scan data are one-to-one with how they look in the real world, but the downside is that you're limited to that hyper-realistic art direction as well as materials that exist in the real world and are able to be scanned. Okay, so at this point we've set the foundation for the relationship between 3D meshes and 2D materials. We understand the relevance and power of tileable textures and the trade-offs between procedural and scanned approaches to creating them. So I think now we can get into where AI fits in with all this. Over the past year, Midjourney, Dalle, and others have been making huge strides in their ability to create 2D images like that one I showed you at the beginning of the video. And given what we just covered in that game environment materials are created from 2D images, naturally game artists have been testing these platforms' ability to create textures that they can then convert into tileable materials. While researching for this video, one of the earliest ones to explore this was an artist and YouTuber called Stan Brown, who has a full hour technical walkthrough he released a year and a half ago now on how to go from a photo to a tileable material using AI and other tools. It's an absolutely excellent walkthrough. I'll put a link for it in the description for those who are interested. However, today, as we all know, AI is moving insanely quickly, and since then there have been some exciting new updates, especially a few coming from Adobe that have caught my eye and got me excited to see what is possible today. As I mentioned, I spent the last week generating thousands of tests in both Midjourney and Dalle 3. If you remember that asphalt material I showed you earlier, I have a bit of a confession in that it actually wasn't a Megascans material. It was created using AI, Adobe, and Unreal 5 in the exact workflow I'll be walking you through now. Admittedly, there are a number of caveats and limitations to its usability that require a few workarounds, which I'll be showing you, but I just wanted to illustrate that today, in its current form, it's already very usable for those who understand and can work around its limitations. For those curious and who stick around to the end of this video, I'll also be sharing my prediction for the future of how this workflow will likely evolve based on what I've been seeing coming out of Midjourney and other AI tools, and also what Adobe's been developing towards the past few months. But real quick, before we get to those later predictions and the workflow here in a second, if you've found this video interesting or helpful so far, and like me, you're interested and curious in where the future of world building is going and want to find your way back to my future videos, make sure you hit subscribe, since YouTube likely won't be recommending my very new YouTube channel otherwise. So yeah, with that, let's take a look now at the workflow we'll be going through over the rest of this video. The first step will be creating images. So we'll go into Midjourney and Dalle 3, and I'll show you how I'm creating the image bases for our textures, talking about the pros and cons of each platform at the moment. Second, we'll be taking those images and prepping them, making sure that they have enough resolution and that they actually tile. Midjourney, as you'll see, has built-in tools for this, but Dalle does not at the moment. And even Midjourney, with that built-in tiling tool, doesn't always get it right, so we can double check it in Photoshop. Third, we'll be converting those upscaled and tiled images into materials in Adobe Sampler. Adobe has released some very cool AI tools over the last year that allows us to very easily and simply convert an image into a multi-textured materials. After that, we'll be going into Unreal 5. We'll be exporting the textures from Adobe Sampler into Unreal 5, setting up a very basic blend material. Even if you've never done it before, I'll walk you through it step by step, and then we'll be able to see how those tiling textures look in an environment, how they could fill out an environment very easily. So that's the general framework. Let's go ahead and jump into the first step. Okay, so here we are inside of Midjourney in Discord, and you can see I have two examples here of textures that I've asked Midjourney to tile, and this is what is really cool about Midjourney. No matter what prompt you give it, if you add a -- tile at the end, it will attempt to make it a seamless tiling texture. We can take these into Photoshop and verify them, which I'll be showing you in the next step, but it does a pretty good job even with very, very simple prompts. It does look quite good. And here's an asphalt one that we'll be testing later, and here's another one that I've tried testing. As a little trick that I won't actually be showing you, but now that Midjourney's add vary region, if you want to get variety in these textures, you can just vary regions inside of the border and then combine these edge to edge, and you'll get a larger texture which has higher resolution. That is the downside of Midjourney right now, that they're stuck at a 1024 resolution for the tiling textures. They did just add an upscale recently for regular pictures that you're or regular images that you're generating in Midjourney, but unfortunately it hasn't, as of the recording today, made it over to the tiling texture. Here are a couple. You can see very simple prompts, but they do look quite good. So we'll bring those over into Photoshop in the next step. But first, let's take a quick look at Dalle. Here we are looking at Dalle 3, and compared to Midjourney, it has a couple pros, but it does have a couple cons. I've really enjoyed working with the prompts here in Dalle. It's very, very iterative. You can have a conversation with it and iterate towards something you want. Even if it's not 100% accurate, it does feel like it's actually listening to you, where Midjourney really prefers just keywords, and even those, it misses some. This is something that I've worked with a long time, so I have been able to get what I wanted out of it, but Dalle is kind of interesting in, I was generating this reference here for a chair that I'm building, and I kind of liked a lot of the materials that it had there, so I just asked it to start creating some tiling materials, and you can see here it started getting there. It's obviously the same colors and even some of the same texture variation here, but not exactly in the same pattern. So I iterated further. I asked it to make it edge to edge, top down view. It did that, but it still has a bit of distortion and bulges. So I asked it to remove a little bit of that, and it just kind of iterated towards something that was a little bit more of a usable pattern. It doesn't unfortunately have that -- tile feature. You can't force a tiling in Dalle 3 right now. So that's a downside, though the controllability is pretty interesting. So that's a little bit of a pros and cons on either side. I've also noticed that Dalle tends to do this. It doesn't fully understand what a texture is. It's showing me a beautiful texture here. The detailing here is amazing, but it puts it already applied onto an object or a sphere. It's probably pulling from different actual texture applications and renders that people are showing online, and it says, oh, this is a texture, you probably want to present it like this. Not very useful for what we're doing today. What I have been doing, since I've been getting a lot of very nice images out of Dalle, is I've been taking those texture references and building out a reference catalog. I'll include this as a free download. I have about 100 of these saved up right now. So if you were interested, you can check it out down in the description. But these are very useful when I'm creating my handmade textures over in Designer or in Painter, because they have a really high fidelity and something you really can't just find online. This isn't something people could just go out and scan or take a photo of. Especially for somebody like me who works in sci-fi, this has been a really nice tool to build out references, even if it's not very useful for today's practice of creating the tiling textures. So I'll put a link to that in the description for everybody who's interested in downloading that and checking out sort of the references that I've been able to build up. So here's a selection of images that I had made in Midjourney and Dalle. Some of them already tile and some of them don't, but I wanted to create a few of them that might look cool in the cyberpunk environment I'll be showing you over in Unreal. So we have this pitted concrete wall, a couple different asphalts, this sort of sci-fi wall texture, an alien organic feel, and a dirty ground that we can try blending between some of these. Here's the images we'll be bringing in. I want to show you a couple examples of how to upscale these and to make sure or to create tiling out of them. So the best upscaler I found around is Gigapixel AI. It definitely does the best job at preserving or creating details where there weren't any, and you can even do it in batches. It isn't free. I think it costs around $100. I won't be using this one, but I just want to show you that it is available. I think that if you are a pixel peeper, this is a very good tool for that. If you want to grab it, you can head over to Topaz's website. They have a more premium tool which does things like sharpening and denoising, but this is just the upscaler. I think it's around $100. And yeah, for now, I think let's go over to Photoshop. For those of you who don't have Gigapixel and don't want to spend the money, Photoshop does have a built-in upscaling tool that I didn't even know existed before a year ago. So if you go to File, Open As, instead of just Open, and you go ahead and select the image that you want to open. Here, I'll do this non-tiled example. And you change the file type. Instead of to Photoshop or JPEG or whatever it is, you instead hit Camera Raw and open. This will bring up the Camera Raw menu, which gives you access to something called Enhance, which will do, I think, what Adobe calls super resolution. Yeah, super resolution here. And it does go from something that's a little bit blurry at this much of a zoom to something that's a bit sharper. And it does effectively add resolution to your image. So if you hit Enhance, and then we open it into Photoshop, we can verify by going to image size, which was what, 1K before, now it's 2K. So we did increase the resolution super easily just with built-in Photoshop tools. I don't know if it uses AI, I'm not quite sure. For what I've been doing, it has been high enough quality. Let's go ahead and get rid of these grid lines. Okay, so there's a couple ways to test if this tiles. Using Midjourney, you can use -- tile to force it. Sometimes it's not perfect, so this is one way you can verify. If you go to Edit, Define Pattern, hit OK to define it. Then go ahead and add a pattern. Go down to our latest one, which will be the one you just defined. Hit OK, and now you can drag it around and see if it's seamless, which it very much is not. This was not created using that -- tile command. We'll go ahead and fix this, but for now, let's undo and delete this pattern. The way that we make sure that this is a pattern, a seamless pattern, is you go up to Filter, Other, and we'll offset it. And you're going to need to offset it by half of whatever the image resolution is. 1 in the negative, 1 in the positive. Doesn't matter which one you do. Go ahead and hit OK, and you'll see these lines. This is where the seamless pattern is breaking. This one is pretty rough, if I'm being honest, so I don't know how well this is going to work. Some work better than others. Photoshop has fortunately added in Gen AI right into Photoshop, so it's a lot easier than trying to like hand clone stamp all this out. That YouTube video by Dan I had mentioned earlier was using Dalle 2 to do this, which was pretty prophetic on his part last year, where he had taken these images into Dalle and used its tools to fill in these seam lines, which gave pretty good results. And I think that if I did have a lot of credits lying around in Dalle 2, I would go ahead and give that a shot. But this is free, built into Photoshop again. It's about speeding up workflows and processes. So using super resolution in here and using Gen AI built right in is a really nice workflow. So let's go ahead and select a nice padding around the division lines. Sometimes you got to tweak and play with this a little bit, but let's start with this. and we'll hit generative fill. It'll just sample from areas around it if we don't add any prompt. We might need to add a prompt to give it more context, but let's go ahead and try it just as is for now. Let's hit generate. Okay, so here's the result. It did a pretty good job. There are some cracks here, but it did fill in the division line. Let's see how it, okay, this one's a lot nicer. There's a lot less of that large line. That's one thing we need to think about when we're doing this. If you think about a tiling texture in a game environment, the standard for a lot of games nowadays is 1K resolution per meter. So if you think about this tile, which is now 2K, as a 1K per meter resolution, that means that what we're looking at here should be covering around 2 meters. Now, that definitely plays a big part in terms of how zoomed in you want to be on the texture. Does this feel, do these cracks feel like something that's just spread, in this case, around a meter? And it was quite large. This is going to be a huge gap. So you might want to get rid of some of these using more of the generative fill or clone stamping or whatever it is. I think it's okay for now, because we don't need to belabor this point, but that is something that you'll need to take into consideration. So let's check the third one. This one's quite good as well. It's very difficult to choose. It did a very good job. I think we'll stick with this one for now. So if you remember, we had offset this and selected the edges both horizontally and vertically, and everything within the borders is now seamless, but we had selected the edges, which means that this edge would no longer match up with this edge. So we need to offset one more time. Here and merge everything upwards with Control-Alt-Shift-E, the best shortcut in Photoshop. We'll go ahead and offset that again, but this time, if you remember, we had halved the original resolution to 1024. Now we need to half that resolution again down to 512 and look for those offset lines. You can already see them. Here are where those edges ended up. Here is not perfect, and there should be one over here, but it's pretty good. You can't, oh, here it is. Here we go. So let's select both of those, and again, we can just generative fill. Let's give it a little bit of room to play with. Hold shift to select this one as well. And we'll generative fill. Here's the result. It added a little crack here. We can check another one. I think I'm going to go with less cracks. I think that the smaller frequency will make sense given how much space this is meant to cover. I don't want so many of these huge, large cracks. And up here, let's double check that it's a good choice. Yep, looks pretty good. Just as a final test, let's go ahead and define that as a pattern, drag it around and see how it feels. So define pattern. Don't give it a name because that's what artists do. Pattern, select the final pattern, and then we'll drag it around and see. And as you can see now, there are no division lines. This is a good way to test if you have too large of, here you can see this crack stands out a lot. It's going to cover an entire meter. So this is something that you'd probably want to get rid of if you were going to use this as something that was supposed to be a base tiling texture that wasn't supposed to stand out. Okay, so now that we've finished tiling this texture and upping its resolution, we can just export it as a PNG and bring it over into the next stage. Okay, so here we are in Adobe Substance 3D Sampler. I want to say up front that this won't be an in-depth tutorial of Sampler. The official YouTube channel of Adobe has a lot of good material on this, but I just want to show you a couple quick examples of how to get in and out of Adobe Sampler very quickly so we can get from Midjourney into Unreal as fast as possible. So we'll go ahead and drag in an asphalt material or whatever material you're working with over into this box up here. And this is where a lot of the magic happens inside of Sampler. It uses AI to go from an image to a material with all of the textures you need. You'll notice here, this is a 1K texture. I did not take this into Photoshop. I just came straight out of Midjourney. You can upscale this here by clicking 2K and then selecting upscale, but for now, we'll just leave it as 1K and import this in. Here you can see this processing up here, and we already have very quickly a material here that shows a pretty realistic asphalt. If you click over into 3D, 2D, you can see down here all of the different texture maps that it generated. You can see the roughness here, height, normals, and back to base colors. Very, very quickly created all of these different maps, which would take a long time. And honestly, to get this type of look, it would take a long time, especially for a new artist in Designer, to get something of this quality and be able to just drag it in. And Sampler is pretty powerful, especially for materials that are maybe more background or just something that you're going to layer things on top of. This is a very, very quick workflow. Let's go ahead and go over to viewer settings, which I already had open, and make this a rounded cube. You can adjust the tiling down here. It's already on 2, so it's repeating twice across this surface. And you can see it's doing a very good job. This is straight out of Midjourney. As I mentioned, there was no tiling done. If you did it in Photoshop, it would look like this as well, but just with that dash dash tile, we're already getting a very seamless look. Okay, so let's go over into wet asphalt, which I've already prepped down here. This is an image that I also got directly out of Midjourney, and you can see here it's 1K resolution. So it didn't even take it into Photoshop, but Sampler did add in an upscale tool. So if you come into here, type in upscale, you can add an upscale layer where you come in here, upscale it to 2 times or 4 times. It's quite slow in my experience in Sampler, so sometimes I'll just go directly into Photoshop, upscale, get that nice resolution, bring it over into Sampler. But it is an option in here. I haven't compared it 1-to-1, not too sure of the quality differences, but if I had to go in order, it would be Gigapixel to be best case. Photoshop is good if you have a little bit slower computer, but I think that Adobe is spending a lot of time working on these AI upscales here in 2 times and 4 times. This was one of the big updates in 4.2 recently, so I think they are putting some attention here, probably worth paying attention to. But for now, we'll leave it off just to keep things quick and look at the material we have here. I noticed that as opposed to the other asphalt, which was pretty rough, here we had a quite glossy look where the asphalt almost felt like it was wet, maybe had some oil or rain, which got me thinking maybe I can lean into that using a built-in tool here in Sampler, which was water. So if you come into add layer, type in water, it'll add this layer. Let's toggle it on to see what I have here. And yeah, with that, you can see it just already adds in water. The water has some dirt and variation, almost like an oil stain. But if you come in here, you can make some changes. Let's go to plane just to get a better view of this. Hold shift and drag right click to see the light move around. And you can adjust very easily just by dragging the height level of that water fills to. This is a really easy way to create blend materials, by the way. I'll show you a bit later, but if you want to create one with a lot less water and one with a lot more water and then blend them in Unreal, it's a very quick way to get variation out of your materials and to hide a bit of that repetition. Here we can adjust the water darkness, bringing it way lighter or way darker depending on the look you're going for. And you can adjust the edge wetness up where it creeps up along the rest of your material. So very cool, very quick. There's ones for snow, moss, very nice and easy ways to make what was originally just an image out of Midjourney into something that feels like a very well considered material. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and export these. It's very simple. You come up to File, Export, you choose a folder, come into Material Settings, and this is very important. This will not be on PNG at the beginning. It'll be on something like SBSAR or SBS. You can bring these over into Designer, where you can use this as a base to build out a more complex material. For material artists, this might be a very nice workflow where you get something very quickly out of Midjourney or Dalle, bring it into Sampler, make a couple changes, bring it over into Designer, and then have all the control that you're used to in Designer or over into Painter, apply this to different models using different procedural masks. And I think this is really, really cool and probably part of my workflow going forward. But for now, we just come into PNG. It'll give you access to presets, one of those being Unreal Engine. And you can see here the textures is going to export our base color, it'll export your normals, and it'll export a packed map of your ambient occlusion, your roughness, and metallic. So we'll go ahead and export and then hop over into Unreal. Okay, here we are in Unreal Engine 5 in a cyberpunk environment that I was showcasing in my previous AI HDRI lighting tutorial. If you didn't follow that and you didn't see how to set up lighting like this, that's okay. You can just go ahead and create a blank new scene coming into the latest version of Unreal, coming over to games and setting up either a first or in my case, a third person template, clicking on starter content, ray tracing, and just starting your project. They have a few starter maps that have very neutral lighting, which are actually more advisable to test the look of your textures and materials. Usually you want to have a very blank canvas as far as lighting goes, so you can see exactly what the texture looks like without all of this color and mood applied. I prefer this look and mood since we're just doing this for fun. I'm just showing you the overall workflow. But if you are very serious about testing textures and materials, you'll want to have more of that blank Unreal scene with just very clean daytime lighting or nighttime lighting, but something that isn't as stylized as this HDRI. If you are interested in something more moody like this, I'll go ahead and share a link right now that should be popping up to that previous video. Should just take you a few minutes to get back to a look like this. And so with that, we'll need, together with this scene, either a stylized one like this or that blank scene. All we'll need is a simple plane with a little bit of topology. So I'll come over here into Blender, create this 2 meter by 2 meter plane, go into vertex mode and add just a little bit of topology. I'll explain why we want this in a bit, but it has to do with blend materials, which I'll be showing you how to set up. So just create a super simple plane, set your pivot point wherever you want, export this as an FBX, and bring it into Unreal. And then that'll be enough to get us started. And just as a quick overview of what I'll be showing you, we'll first be setting up a very simple base material that'll take all of those textures you created from Sampler and combine them into a material you can apply to a plane like this, which we brought over from Blender. Here you can see I've tiled them across and it does in fact look seamless. I'll show you how to set up a very basic material to accomplish this. Then I'll be showing you how to blend a few different textures together. So here we have 3 different materials going on, which, as you can see, really breaks up that repetition. Back here, there is no breakup. There is no vertex painting, blending between different materials. Here it looks, this just took actually a few seconds to blend these together, but you can already see the power of something like this. I'll show you, again, a very simple blend material that you can use to blend together a couple different things that you export from Sampler. Lastly, I'll be showing you a little bit more of a fun material that makes use of more of the features built into Sampler, and it gets away from a little bit of this maybe more traditional materials and these asphalts and dirt and water. And I'll show you how to set up a pretty cool little alien landscape, and I'll save that for last. But for now, let's go ahead and get started on that base material. So I'll delete these planes and we'll start from scratch. Let's go ahead and delete them. By pushing Control Space, we'll bring up this bar here and we'll go into our materials folder. Here you can see some of the ones I already set up, but we'll start from scratch by right clicking, going with the material, calling it MM for master material, and we'll call it test base material, and we'll call it 01. Double clicking will bring us in. And I won't go into too much detail or depth into what everything does. I'll just show you how to very quickly get a similar result to what I'm getting. So we have our base material here, and now we need to bring in our textures. Control Space will bring that back up again, and we'll go over to our textures folder, which I've created. You can right click, do new folder to create your own. Come into asphalt. And I already have these imported, but you can just go to your Finder window and drag these PNGs over into here, and it'll automatically import them. I'll go ahead and select them, drag them into here. We have our base color here, we have our normals, and we have our packed map. Drag in our base color from RGB, we'll drag in our normals to normal, and we'll drag the red channel, which in this case is our ambient occlusion. Over to ambient occlusion, we'll drag in our roughness, and we'll drag in our metallic. Okay, so you can see it already applied it to the sphere here, so it does seem like it's working. We'll also want to make sure these have just a little bit of functionality in terms of not having to set up this material over and over again. So we'll create exposed parameters for all of our different textures. We can use the same material and just duplicate it. And we'll also set up tilings so we can control the frequency of how often this tiles. Like I mentioned before, a lot of games today use a density of 1K resolution per meter, but we'll set up a tiling ability so we can dial it up and down and just kind of play with it in the engine. So the way we do that is we'll go ahead and push tab to bring up our search. We'll type in coordinates and look for texture coordinates. Here we can drag this into our UVs. In this case, since our UVs are spread across the whole tile, this will mostly be used just to set our tiling. And so here we can set our tiling for the U and V coordinates. By typing in 2, for example, it'll tile 2 times, but we want to make this a little bit more controllable. So what we will do is hold M, type in a multiply. We'll hold Shift and left click to bring this over to here. We'll hold 1, which will bring up a parameter. We'll drag this in to the B slot. We'll drag texture coordinates into the A slot. And now this texture coordinate will be multiplied by whatever we have in this parameter. So we'll set that as a default to 1. That 1 will multiply by the texture coordinates, which are here 1. And they will multiply the UVs across all 3 textures. And we will be able to tile it in an exposed parameter outside of this material, which I'll show you here in a second. Okay, so we have a nice base, but like I said, we don't want to come back in and create a new material for every single texture. If we right click on each one and hit convert to parameter, we'll give it a name, and I'll explain why this is important in a few seconds, but we'll call it A, base color. Do the same for these other ones. Okay, you can see here I converted both of the others to parameters as well. And we're going to go into each one and set their grouping to A, as I've named them. So this one is set as A, and A. And then we'll go ahead and hit save. Now we can minimize this, go back into where our materials were. And we have this test base material 01. Now this material is good to go, but what we're going to do is we're going to right click and do create material instance, rename this as material instance and call it material instance. And I think we'll create this as an asphalt. So we'll do asphalt test and we'll pop that open. Okay, so this looks very different, right? We're no longer in the node setup. Instead, we have these textures that we had placed as placeholders into that graph and the ability to toggle them on. And now what we can do is just using this material instance, we can pop in textures directly into these. So we can duplicate material instances and just slot in new textures. I've noticed that I didn't set the tiling as a parameter. So let's go back and fix that in our master material. Here you can see our value as 1. We'll convert that to a parameter and we'll call this tiling. Perfect. Back in here after we hit save. And now you can see tiling is set as 1. Okay, dial that up and down. Okay, cool. So we have our first material and material instance set up. Let's drag in our mesh to test it. Mesh. Here I've imported the FBX of the plane with that little bit of topology. I'll drag it into the scene, move it up. Control space to bring back open our dock. Go to our materials. We will not apply the master material. We will apply the material instance, which is our MI asphalt test, and we'll drag it onto the plane. And here you can see we have the material set up. Let's test the tiling to see if it works actually in the scene. Here we have them side by side. We have our texture applied and we have the controllability here. Let's test the tiling to make sure it works. Seems like it does. Perfect. And let's put a plane next to the plane. I'm going to hold Alt and drag to the side, which duplicates it here. And I'll select both. I'll hold Alt and Shift and drag, which will bring the camera with it. It's usually a little bit more smooth than that, but here we go. Okay, cool. And if we adjust the tiling, you can see it working. And that is our first base material with textures brought in from Sampler and applied to these planes from Blender. So now that we have that base material and instance created, I want to introduce the idea of vertex blending and the ability in Substance Sampler to work with a texture that didn't quite look good in Unreal. What we'll first do is go back into those materials. We'll duplicate our material instance, which was MI asphalt test. Create a material instance. We'll call that, let's call this concrete test. We'll open that up. Toggle these on along with the tiling. Go into our textures where I've imported textures over from Sampler of this concrete texture, and you'll see that there are seams. We'll discuss that in a second, but I want to show you what it looks like in Unreal first. In Unreal, I've imported it into my textures folder, into my wall, and these are the originals. So we'll drag the base color. You can see it updates. We'll drag the normal. We'll drag the packed map and turn on tiling. Let's hit save. And we'll put this on the walls. Select them all. Go back to our new material here, and we'll drag this onto the walls. And there you have it. You can see that we do have pretty defined lines between them. A lot of these divots stand out quite a bit, and there's a lot of things we can do to make this fit nice. So let's first adjust the tiling and see what if that's able to help. So let's just put this here. Let's try adjusting the tiling. Okay, we definitely don't want to tile that direction. Let's go tiling twice. Okay, we have a lot of the division lines now. The occlusions do feel a bit nicer, but I think we'll need to go back into Sampler to fix this texture a bit more before we're able to do anything more in Unreal. Back in Sampler, what I've done are a series of things which I want to show you. First, I upscaled inside of Sampler. I didn't go into Photoshop at all. I've added in a make it tile layer, which is something actually built into Substance Sampler. If you go into add layer, type in tile, you can do make it tile in here. And so if we toggle that on, you can see it does do a pretty good job. Admittedly, I did tweak the threshold, smoothness, and contrast, and the color equalizer. So you might need to play with it. It works better on some textures than others. I have a much better time doing this in Photoshop for complex materials, but for very simple ones like this, you might be able to get away with Sampler alone. I've also added in some more complexities where all I could really see were these divots. So I added in some cracks, which adds a bit of noise and variety. Added in a dust layer, which adds to the occlusion area of those. But what I did then was I used a content aware fill, which we can see a little bit better in 3D and 2D view, where I came in and painted out any of the large distracting areas. And as you can see, they're just gone. Of course, you can do that with clone stamp or generative fill in Photoshop, but it's pretty nice. The feature is just in here as it is. I've also created a dirt layer where by toggling this on, I'm able to get a lot more variety. You can see it's tiling twice, but I'm able to get a lot more variety out of a single texture with just a simple layer. I'll export a set of textures with dirt off, and I'll export a set of textures with dirt on, and we'll blend them together to hide a little bit of the repetition over in Unreal. So let's hop back over to Unreal after having exported with dirt off and with dirt on, and I'll show you what that looks like. Back in Unreal now, what we'll first do is import our textures which don't use the dirt. Let's go into, again, our concrete test. And having imported the new textures, we'll go over into wall. And here are those new textures with some of the improvements made. So I'll drag these in and see if we're able to get a better result. Let's hit save, we'll minimize that. And I think we've made some improvements. The cracks are a little bit large, so I'll adjust the tiling, but a lot of those big pockets are missing, which I think is feeling a little bit nicer. Let's go back to, if you click on a layer that has a material, you can just search for it and bring it back open, and let's adjust the tiling to, let's say 2 to make the size of everything a bit smaller. Okay, so this is a nice base. You can definitely see repetition, which we'll use our vertex painting to help mask, but a lot better than we had before. Now that we have that base concrete set up, we want to create what's called a blend material, which is very simple and easy to do. There are a lot of approaches to this with various degrees of complexity, but we'll set up a very simple one. Back here in our master material, what we're going to do is come over to our test base material and select use material attributes. This will unhook everything, move this over. And instead what we're going to type in is tab to bring up our search, make material attributes, and rehook everything up. And now we have everything working again just as it was. But in order to create the blend material, what we'll do is select all of our nodes, Control C, Control V, and paste this down below. Now you can see they're named the same. So we'll want to give this new set unique names. What we can do is come in here and just change all these to B and set new groups. I actually noticed here that I was spelling out the alphabet a little bit earlier. You might have caught that I had named these A, B, C. What we wanted to do was to have each one A and all in a group A, and now all named B and in group B. It looks like our normal here needs to be set to group B. And tiling as well, set to, call this B tiling, set to group B. And we'll put this tiling as group A. Perfect, so now we have our two different set of materials that we want to blend together. And we can do that by typing in tab, searching for vertex color, and then tab again, and searching for blend material attributes. And this will allow us to blend material A with material B. Using a vertex color, we'll start with red into the alpha and drag this in. So now, which I'll be showing you, if when we vertex paint red, it'll use this material, and when we clear out that red, it'll use this material. And just to show you the extensibility of this, we can go ahead and do the exact same thing again, Control C, Control V. Use another blend material attributes and set it up for a third material, this time using green as the vertex color. And we'll take this blend material attributes into A and hook this up into the final output. And that's it. So now we can blend between 3 different materials. We'll want to make sure that these are named as C, and then we're good to go. Now when we come back over in our material instance, you can see different sets of textures. If we go ahead and put on B, we can add in the dirt variation of that concrete that I mentioned we exported earlier from samplers. Come back into our textures, and in our wall, drag in our dirt variation and put this in base color, normal, packed map, and make sure that it's using the most recent version of our clean concrete. We'll now be able to blend between the 2 of these. You'll see C is on the top, which is using these placeholders. We're not seeing it here yet, but as long as we aren't using the green vertex color, we'll be able to clear this out very easily. So let's hit save and go back into the scene. And now that we're back in the scene, you can already see that it's applied that dirt version of the texture. So we'll go ahead and clear that out. But in order to vertex paint, what you'll want to do, especially if you're going across different meshes, is select all of them. Go into our selection mode, and we'll go into our mesh painting. We'll go into paint, and we can visualize what's going on here between the different blends. Let's go into our blue channel, and there's nothing there. Green channel, nothing there. Red channel, very much there. The painting itself is controlled down here, so we'll go to red. Let's go ahead and fill, which means it clears out whatever was there. And then we'll go back to off so we can see. And you can see here the clean concrete. So now we can paint in the dirt and variation on top of this to give it a little bit more variation compared to what it has right now. So we'll go ahead and go white. White means you're painting the color. Black means you're clearing out the color, and you can toggle between them just by tapping X. And let's adjust the size. Let's go a little bit smaller. Turn on the strength a little bit, and we'll want to be on the red channel because we want to paint that first dirty tileable texture. And as we hover over, you can see it highlighting different vertexes. This is why earlier we wanted to add a little bit of topology in Blender, because the vertexes are what hold this information. If you didn't have these vertexes, it would only be able to use the corner, so you wouldn't be able to add too much variety throughout the meshes. Let's go ahead and test what this looks like. Just by painting, you can see that we're adding in the dirt very, very subtly. Let's turn this strength up just a little bit and paint in the corners. I think here it would make sense that a lot of the dirt would build up around this wall as we go out into the mesh. Let's turn this size up a little bit. And we're bringing in that blend material. If we go out of this view and hit G to clear that out, you can see that we're already adding in variation. And the more complex you have, or the more variety you have in this blend material, the more you can break this up. And it not only helps hide seams if you have more than one selected as you paint across it, but it helps get rid of a lot of that repetition. And that is what I had done over here, where even though we're using a landscape here, I had built out a material that included 3 different textures in sampler. So if we go over into sampler, you can see we have this base asphalt, which is taking up most of the scene in Unreal. If we zoom out, you can see it tiling very, very clearly here. Where over here, if we go back to sampler, I've blended in this wet asphalt to bring in some of these puddles and created a version of this wet asphalt here as a separate material, but you could have just done it as a layer where I've added in a lot more water. So you can see here, as I select this terrain and I go into my vertex painting, paint, I can very easily, let's do, for example, let's paint some more green. Let's put it pretty strong. You can see here, whoop, that was a little strong. Let's go back to X. And it's quite large here. So let's go to 0.005, maybe even 0.001, and let's paint a little bit. So what I had been doing is, you can see this gutter over here. I had been building up a bit of dirt and muck. So let's go ahead and add that in with white. And yeah, of course you'd want to finesse this quite a bit, but just with a few clicks and a very simple material back into our blend material, you can get a very nice look between these textures, and making use of some things like water or snow or moss. You can get nice blend materials and variety out of maybe even just a single texture. So with that, let's quickly do one more wall just to show variety, something that isn't so simple as concrete. I set up these walls very similar to how I did the concrete walls. I just dragged them over, duplicated the material instance, came in here, added my clean textures and the dirty variations of the textures, set the tiling to where it felt correct, and this is what we have. I think that for something that came directly out of Midjourney, this is already something that looks very detailed and fitting in a sci-fi or cyberpunk environment. Of course, we're focusing on this now, but if you were just to walk by it, I think most players wouldn't really notice. This is something that you didn't spend hours or days on in Designer, which is pretty interesting. But let's go ahead and try adding in a bit of that variation with the blend material. Selecting all of them so it blends across the seams of the different meshes. Coming into paint, and I believe we set it to the green channel. Let's make this a bit larger. We can reset it using these arrows, and let's try painting. Yep. We'll want to make sure that this is in areas that make sense. Let's paint in the corners, next to the walls, maybe next to this barricade. And the whole idea is to hide a little bit of the variation. If we go over into sampler, I can show you I did a little bit here to add in more variation. So if we go to the sci-fi wall and it loads, I not only added a dirt layer, what I did was use a content aware fill to, if we toggle it off, you can see what I did, where a lot of these things that were standing out in the original texture, I just content aware filled to remove. And this isn't major, but it does mean that one version of this texture will look very different than the other, or at least quite different with very little effort. So you'll want to avoid the edges, because those are the things that we need to make sure are still seamless. But by painting those out, this placed next to another version of it, you're not going to notice a lot of those distracting bright colors that through a small space, maybe over just 2 meters, you might notice them repeating very strongly. So I've done that, and I've added dirt over in Unreal. As we paint these, you can see some of these yellow pieces here. If I paint over it, they disappear. And that gives a little bit more of that variety. Very subtle. You can do a couple blend materials, but very simply, you can see we have a lot more of that dirt buildup and variation compared to what we had before. Let's just toggle it off for comparison. Hopefully this will come across clearly, but go into paint, we had our green layer, and let's just fill and remove it. And here you can see already, you're noticing a lot more of that repetition. So go back into paint, paint them out, and get rid of it, and now it feels much better. Here we're looking at that final texture that I promised. It's in a base version right now. We'll do a lot more with this, but I got this directly out of Midjourney, and it immediately reminded me of something that's very alien. So let's get out of this camera and you can see it here. I was thinking at first it would be some sort of really cool organic wall, but then I started thinking maybe we can create a landscape out of this. That is something that very easily in Sampler we can make look extremely alien and unique, and something that would be very difficult, again, to replicate in Designer for a new artist. So let's go back over into Sampler and take this and create something very cool out of it. So back in Sampler here, create a new material. Here I have a base, and I'll drag in that texture that you saw from Unreal. And here we go, straight from Midjourney. We'll do 1K. Let's leave it as 1K for now so that everything propagates a bit quicker. We'll import it. And here we have that organic texture, which I'll be creating a terrain out of. One of the things that Sampler has been updating a lot are a lot of these different categories that they're training their models on. So here, let's go with organic instead of ground, which it was originally. And we'll go ahead and close 2D for now and just look at the 3D so we can get a better view of it. And let's toggle back and forth between organic and ground just to see the difference. Here's ground. And here's organic. It's subtle, but I like the finish on this one a lot more. We can even move it over into shiny. Let's leave it there for now. And we'll start adding in some of the things that I think will make this feel a lot more like an alien landscape. So we'll add in the water again, making it almost feel like a series of pools. Drag down the water level. Oh, you know what? Let's move it up a little bit. And we'll adjust the water darkness to be a lot brighter. And add in some moss. You can barely see the moss as it is. There's a couple different ways that you can set it up, just generally on top of everything. You can see, or we can use the occluded areas to feed the moss. And since it's an alien landscape, let's go with something more orangish, kind of like maybe this. And let's adjust a little bit more of the moss settings. So here there's a lot of different options. Really, I just want a little bit more of it. And adjusting where it is in relation to the water will make a big difference. Whether it's underneath the water, which I like the look of more. We'll increase this a little bit. There we go. I think this is enough. Let's adjust the tiling to see what it would look like a little bit larger. Almost feels like some sort of alien growth coming out of the water. I think we can dial up this saturation just a little bit more. It's Halloween after all, and it is an alien landscape, so it can be a little bit fun with it. Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and export this back over into Unreal. If you wanted to blend it, again, you could mess with things like water levels or moss, or add in a bit of dirt and then export two different versions. And again, blend between them, but we'll just keep it simple for now. Let's export this. So we're back in Unreal 5, and I'll just select all these and drag them over. Alt-Shift, drag them over so we can compare the original to something that's a little bit more spiced up like we did in Sampler. Control-Space to go to our materials. I've already set this up. I just duplicated over the instance. Added in the new base texture with that moss, and I couldn't help myself, so I did a blend variation with more water. And let's go ahead and apply that. If you have them all selected, instead of applying them one by one like I've shown you in our past textures, if you just select it and come over here to this little use selected asset from content browser, it'll update all of them. So here you can see it added in our full water blend that has water covering most of it, and our moss. You can see here the moss is very dark, and this is what I was talking about earlier, where you probably want to work on this in a neutral environment and then only adjust the lighting later to match the mood. There's pros and cons to both, right? Like you can see the clean orange to make sure it looks good, but eventually it's going to be in an environment like this. So if you're only using the moss in this environment and will be used across different environments, you might want to test it in that final look. So here we have it drug in. Let's adjust the vertex painting so we're not just on that full water layer. With all of them selected, we'll go into mesh paint. Paint. Let's get rid of the green layer for now, I believe. So we'll select black to erase it. Green and fill. And this brings us in that layer that does have water, but not filled all the way, and then we can do some of the painting. So now let's try doing a little bit of that blending. Again, we'll select them all. Back into mesh paint. Paint. And let's get rid of some of, or let's add in some of the green, some more of that water. Doesn't quite feel so repetitive. It does feel pretty good tiling wise already, but if we add in the white and just add in a little bit of the water around and just for comparison's sake, we'll select all these and put a clean version next to it. Back into mesh paint, paint, X to swap, fill to fill it. So here is the version without the mesh painting, and you can see even with just a couple dabs, this one does have a lot more variation. Let's select here. Just want to add more in this section. Mesh paint, paint, white, green. Add in a lot more water over here. And yeah, that's pretty much it. You can dial this in, add another blend layer, but in general, I think that this is a pretty interesting texture, something that would be very difficult to create on your own, especially if you're new. So definitely worth trying out. I think it's extremely viable in its current state. It'll get better. I'll talk about that here in a second, but I think that this is a very interesting tool that I'll be adding to my workflow as I build up my own materials in the future. Okay, cool. So I hope you found all that helpful. I'm really excited to see where all this goes in the coming weeks and months. As far as where I see this workflow fitting in today, I currently think this approach sits somewhere between Designer and Scan materials. It's much quicker than creating something in Designer, though with significantly less control, and it has much more flexibility in creating materials beyond what scanned libraries might include, though with less resolution and fidelity than a real-world material. I think in the short term, a few changes we can expect are that Midjourney adds an upscale to its tile textures, and that Dalle might add some sort of tile command to mirror what Midjourney is doing, or at least the ability to better understand what a texture is versus showing as already applied textures. I also think Adobe will very likely continue improving Sampler to give us better controls over tweaking our image to material creations, as well as introduce more AI features directly into Designer to make generating those huge node networks a bit faster and more intuitive, taking cues from their Gen AI Firefly models. Finally, as a thank you for everyone who made it this far in the video, I've created a free download of 5 tileable textures that I created using the workflow I shared in this video, as well as a pack of 100 texture references that I compiled during all of my tests, which I've been using to both fuel my new prompts in AI, as well as serve as inspiration for my handmade textures. So if you're interested, I've linked that down in the description. And for everyone subscribed, I'll be keeping you up to date on the latest changes and releases as they come in future videos. But until then, I appreciate you all watching. I appreciate all of the continued support and comments on my first videos. Please keep them coming. It's been incredibly helpful as I work to shape this channel. Whether it's down in the comments here or over on Instagram, I'll catch you all soon. I hope you have a good one, and I'll see you in the next one.